my own daughter's wedding. I was told to sit at a table near the kitchen, far from family. I stayed quiet, sipping water, while laughter carried from the head table. Then came her toast. She smiled wide, raised her glass, and said, "Even my broke old dad showed up tonight." The room chuckled. My chest burned, but I kept my face still. What she didn't know was that I had built the very ground beneath her success, and tucked away, waiting, was proof of a secret fortune she thought didn't exist. They believed their words made me invisible. Instead, they pushed me to show a power I had long kept hidden. Do you want to know what happened when I finally revealed the truth? Stay with me until the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The evening air in Asheville carried that crisp bite of fall, the kind that made the leaves crunch underfoot and the sky glow faintly orange before giving way to dusk. A line of cars wound slowly into the circular drive of the hotel ballroom, each one gleaming, polished, carrying well-dressed guests who stepped out with practiced ease. My own car, old but carefully maintained, felt out of place among the luxury sedans and shiny SUVs. Still, I pulled in quietly, parked at the far end, and straightened the modest suit that had served me well for decades. Inside, the lobby shimmered with chandeliers and the faint echo of laughter. I approached the reception table where a young woman handed me a place card without even glancing at me. My name was scrawled wrong, Eldred instead of Eldrick, and the table number told me I'd be seated at the far end of the ballroom, away from the head table where family was meant to sit. For a moment, I stared at the card, wondering if it was a mistake or if it was something more deliberate. The ballroom sparkled. Long tables gleamed under polished silverware. Wine glasses stood in precise rows. Candles flickered in gold holders. The scent of roses mixed with roasted meats drifted through the air. Everything looked perfect, except for the tug inside my chest. The nagging sense that perfection didn't include me. Guests in sleek dresses and tailored suits drifted by, some offering polite nods, others moving as if I were no more than part of the wallpaper. When I reached my assigned spot, I froze. My table was tucked near the catering station, where servers hurried back and forth balancing trays. A few distant relatives sat there, people I barely knew. One of the servers, a young man in a black vest, glanced at me and muttered, "Sir, the staff area's over there if you're on duty tonight." His eyes slid past me quickly, as if I might actually belong behind the kitchen door. I didn't correct him, just offered a faint smile and lowered myself into the chair, though my chest tightened with each passing second. A ripple of awkward half-smiles circled the table as though no one wanted to address the mistake. Conversations picked up again without me. Forks clinked. The chatter of the other tables swelled into a joyful hum, a rhythm I was not part of. The evening stretched. At one point, a valet passing through the hall clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, thanks for keeping the cars moving out there." The words landed like stones. I forced a nod, not correcting him either. No need. He walked away without a second thought, leaving me to sit in silence. Memories surfaced unbidden. Years of working double shifts, of repairing roofs with my own hands, of signing checks so this very wedding could even be possible. And yet, here in the glow of chandeliers, surrounded by the fruits of those sacrifices, I was nothing more than a shadow mistaken for help. Laughter from across the room drew my gaze. Danica stood near the head table, her hand wrapped around Silas's arm. Both of them smiled, radiant under the lights. Neither glanced in my direction. To them, I may as well not exist. A thought pressed sharp against my chest. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps invisibility was the role they wanted me to play. My fingers gripped the edge of the table, steadying the storm within. For now, I whispered inwardly, "Let it pass." Quiet had its power too. If they wanted me unseen, they had succeeded. But invisibility has a way of turning into power when the right moment comes. The hum of voices in the ballroom had grown fuller, warmer, as more guests drifted toward the dance floor. Plates clinked, laughter spilled across polished tables, and somewhere near the head table, A burst of applause erupted over a toast I hadn't been invited to join. From my seat near the back, the glow of chandeliers seemed to stop short of where I sat, leaving me in a pocket of dim light. Standing felt like stepping into a tide that moved without me. Conversations ebbed and flowed around the room, yet wherever my shoes carried me, sound bent oddly. When I walked past a group of younger cousins, their words cut off midstream, replaced by awkward chuckles. The same pattern repeated again with a circle of Danica's college friends. The hushes weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to leave a trace. No one spoke directly to me, yet the distance settled in like a draft under the door. I pressed on, carrying a steady posture, as if determined that a bent back or lowered gaze wouldn't be the gift they expected. The first sting came casually, in a tone meant to blend into the chatter. A voice, light and dismissive, floated toward me. "He looks like he wandered in from the staff entrance." The words hit harder than they likely intended. A ripple of laughter rose. Not cruelly loud, but deliberately unhidden. Eyes darted in my direction, then away again, guilty in their mirth. Air seemed to thin in my lungs. Yet my steps remained measured. Years of carrying burdens silently had honed that discipline. One deep breath, a still face. Not a single muscle betrayed the heat climbing my chest. If humiliation had a taste, it was metallic, bitter on the tongue, sharper because it came from kin, not strangers. I reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, steadying my hand. A sip washed nothing away, but the act gave me cover. A pause that suggested composure rather than wounded pride. Their laughter ebbed, conversation shifted, and the moment passed for them. For me, it carved a mark that would not fade. Determined to reclaim at least a thread of dignity, I sought out the bride and groom. The head table gleamed under candlelight, a small stage of merriment. Danica stood in a circle of admirers, her dress shimmering like a beacon. Silas hovered near, his smile sharp, eyes scanning the room as if measuring worth in currency rather than character. I drew closer, rehearsing in my head a few words of blessing, nothing grand, just a father's wish for steadiness in marriage, for grace in the storms ahead. The kind of words I had once longed to hear from my own father, never given. "Danica," I began softly, my voice careful not to intrude. She turned her head just enough to hear the first syllable, then, in a motion swift as a door closing, pivoted toward a guest beside her. "Oh, Henry, I'm so glad you came," she exclaimed, cutting clean across my unfinished sentence. The dismissal wasn't an accident. Silas caught my eye at that moment, lips curling into a smirk almost invisible to the untrained. He knew. He had orchestrated this. The conversation flowed on without me, wealthier company now holding their attention. My words of blessing shrank back into my throat, unsaid, dissolving before they ever lived. Standing there felt like waiting for an invitation that would never come. After a beat too long, I nodded silently, though no one noticed, and stepped back from the glow of their circle, returning to my table. The clamor of celebration blurred into a single hum. Each laugh, each glass raised, seemed like a wall built higher between us. Years of sacrifices stacked in memory, late nights on the road, every penny stretched to pay tuition, the countless quiet moments where love had meant labor. Had all of it whispered to them that I was only labor, not legacy? A realization crept in with weight I had not felt before. Perhaps my silence, my habit of stepping aside, of swallowing words to keep peace, had painted me as powerless. Perhaps they believed the man who gave them ground had no ground left to stand on. For the first time, the thought of striking back did not feel unthinkable. Not with anger unleashed tonight, but with patience, with precision. They had taught me invisibility. They had forgotten invisibility makes a man's steps easy to miss until he chooses where to place them. Fingers traced the rim of my glass, steady now, but charged with intent. Watching Danica laugh, her back still turned, I let a vow form quietly in my mind. If they thought I was too small to matter, they had forgotten who built the ground they stand on. The seed of retaliation planted itself then, not in rage, but in resolve. And in the shadows of that ballroom, Plans began to take shape. Plans that would turn tonight's humiliation into tomorrow's reckoning. Dinner was served, and the ballroom shifted into a quieter rhythm. The clinking of silverware against fine china replaced the earlier roar of laughter and chatter. Warm candlelight flickered across the polished silver, glinting off crystal glasses. At the far end of the hall, Danica and Silas sat at the head table, faces glowing under the admiration of guests. Compliments circled around them like bees to honey. In my corner, the shadows seemed thicker. My plate sat untouched for too long, the steam of roasted vegetables and tender beef rising, but my appetite had gone. Guests at nearby tables leaned into one another, whispering stories or snapping photos, never once glancing my way. A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth, forced, brittle, an old man's attempt to hide the sting of being an afterthought. The hum of the room made it clear. I wasn't part of the melody anymore, just background noise. I leaned back, letting the chair creak under my weight, and stared at my daughter across the room. Her laugh rang out clear, a sound that once used to light up my life. Now it sounded like something meant for others, never for me. Resentment pressed in, quiet but steady, the kind that doesn't burst but seeps slowly like water through stone. The sight of her hand resting lightly on Silas's arm drew me into old memories, uninvited and unwelcome. Once, Danica used to call every weekend. She would tell me about her struggles at work, or the little things she'd baked. Then slowly, her voice was replaced. Silas answered more and more often, telling me she was busy or resting. Messages I left seemed to disappear into the void. Thanksgiving 2 years ago still clung to me like smoke. I had called her early, offering to host. I could almost hear her sigh through the phone when she said, "We're too busy this year, Dad. Maybe next time." But next time never came. Silence grew where conversations once lived. That silence was worse than any argument could have been. It wasn't loud or cruel. It was emptiness, deliberate and cold. Tonight's distance at her wedding, her deliberate avoidance, only echoed that betrayal. She wasn't just ignoring me, she was erasing me, and it hurt more than any whispered joke from strangers ever could. My fork hovered above the plate, but my mind drifted further back. The memory of sweat-drenched shirts and aching joints filled me. Long shifts, late nights, double shifts at the plant, all so she could walk across that stage at graduation without debt weighing her down. I could still picture it, her cap slightly crooked, her face glowing with youth and pride. In that moment, I felt my sacrifices had been worth it. Every hour worked, every meal skipped, every night spent in aching silence had been redeemed in her smile. But years later, during an offhand remark at a dinner, she had waved it away. "It wasn't that much," she said with a shrug. Those words pierced deeper than she realized. To her, it was a small footnote in her story. To me, it was blood, sweat, and years shaved off my life. That casual dismissal replayed in my mind now, her coldness at this wedding amplifying its sting. My efforts, once the foundation she stood upon, were now forgotten, belittled, erased. The humiliation pressed into my chest, hot and unrelenting. I gripped the water glass in front of me, the condensation slick under my palm. The coolness of the glass grounded me, kept me from trembling with rage. For too long, I had let silence speak for me. In that silence, they rewrote my worth, turned me into nothing more than a shadow at the edge of their light. Enough. The thought burned with clarity. This wasn't just about a misplaced seat or whispered ridicule. It was about years of erasure, about a daughter I had raised forgetting who had built the ground beneath her. Patience had been my armor, but tonight, it cracked, behind the calm face I wore. A storm gathered. Determination replaced humiliation, shaping itself into something sharper. Their laughter might drown me out tonight, but tomorrow, I would remind them whose name built this family. The clinking of silverware against glass carried through the ballroom as the master of ceremonies stepped forward. Tapping the microphone with a smile too polished to be genuine, plates were being cleared, champagne poured fresh, and every guest leaned forward with their glass in hand. A hush spread across the room, the kind of expectant silence that comes when people anticipate words worth remembering. It was time for the toasts. For a brief moment, warmth stirred in the chest. Surely, this was where my name would be called. I was the father of the bride. If not for me, this evening, this entire celebration would not exist. Years of sacrifice, nights of labor, the roof I kept above their heads, all of it had paved the way to this glittering ballroom in Asheville. I straightened my jacket, hand tightening on the stem of the glass. My eyes stayed fixed on the MC. Names began to roll, a bridesmaid with a teary anecdote, the best man with a rehearsed punchline, even an uncle from Danica's mother's side who stumbled nervously through a speech. Applause followed each. Laughter. Cheers. And then, "Let's wrap this up, folks. Raise your glasses to the beautiful couple." A roar of voices, crystal chiming, and not once did my name leave his lips. The glass shook faintly in my hand as I rose halfway. Instinct fighting the truth. I thought for an instant of clearing my throat, stepping forward, insisting. But then I caught Danica's face. Her smile glowed wide for the room, her cheeks flushed from champagne, but her eyes never touched mine. She clinked her glass with Silas's and turned toward the crowd. I sat back down, the weight of every laugh pressing on me. The toast went on, drowning me in noise as if my presence was air they had already learned to breathe without. The sting ran deeper than a forgotten name. It was erasure. I sat there while cheers echoed, and my silence tasted bitterer than the dry champagne sliding down my throat. A lull came, brief as breath. I glanced across the ballroom. Danica's eyes brushed mine, just a second, but sharp as a blade, cold, commanding. The message needed no words. Stay in your seat, stay small. And then she turned away, shoulders brushing Silas as he leaned in to whisper. They shared a smirk. Something in me steadied, even as my hand trembled against the glass. The humiliation seared hot, but beneath it something else hardened. A line had been drawn tonight, not by me, but by them. I rose when the crowd dispersed back to mingling, step by step. I crossed the room. My shoes made no sound against the polished floor, but my pulse beat like a drum. I stopped just close enough for her to hear me over the chatter, low enough not to draw the room's attention. "Be careful what you erase," I said evenly. "Sometimes the past comes back louder than you expect." Her laugh rang out, not at me, but at some joke a guest shared behind my shoulder. She didn't turn, didn't even flinch, just a shrug of indifference as if my words were wind. I stood there a moment longer, then walked back across the ballroom with my head unbowed. Not broken. The silence I had carried for years no longer felt like surrender. Tonight, it shifted into something sharper. Silence could be a warning, a weapon biding its time. They thought shutting me out was victory. The thought pulsed steady as I sat again, but it was only the opening shot. The ballroom had grown louder, wine and champagne warming voices into bold laughter. Clusters of guests leaned together, their eyes flicking toward me before breaking into easy chuckles. The music, once a soft backdrop, now thumped with the confidence of celebration. Yet beneath the cheer, there lingered a tension that sat heavy across my shoulders. It was clear enough. I wasn't supposed to matter here, but that quiet fire inside had shifted since the toasts. Tonight I would not disappear into silence. I steadied myself, adjusting in the chair that still felt too far from where a father of the bride should sit. Every glance, every sidelong whisper fed the resolve building in my chest. Danica's voice rose above the chatter, polished and commanding. She stood at the head table with Silas, glowing under the lights as though the room itself belonged to her. "And of course," she said brightly, "we're so grateful to Silas's parents, who've given us such support. They've been incredible." Applause swept through the hall. Champagne glasses lifted. My daughter's smile stretched wider, proud to stand beside them. Someone called from the crowd. "And what about your dad?" Danica's hand waved casually, like brushing away a crumb. "Oh, Dad's just here to enjoy the evening." The laughter was instant, quick, sharp, and merciless. It rolled across the tables, bouncing between silver trays and polished glasses. The words struck harder than any misseated chair, harder than the whispers that painted me as staff. They cut through the years I spent working late, every drop of sweat I gave to make sure she could have this life. For a moment, the room tilted. My chest tightened. Heat spread from my neck to my ears. They laughed because she invited them to, because my presence had been marked as a joke. I rose, not quickly, not with the trembling of age, but with the steady certainty of a man who had carried too much for too long. My glass in hand caught the chandelier light, sharp against the hush that began to settle. "Funny," I said, my voice even and clear enough to cut through the murmur. "How easy it is to forget the hands that built your future." The air snapped tight. Chairs shifted. Someone coughed into a napkin. The music faltered in the background, then seemed distant altogether. Danica's smile froze, her eyes darting toward me. "Sit down, Dad, please." The edge in her whisper wasn't for my ears alone. It was for the crowd she wanted to control. Silas leaned close to her, his glare fixed on me, cold and measuring. But I didn't lower my eyes. I held his stare, the glass steady in my grip. A few guests looked at their feet, unsure whether to side with laughter or silence. Others kept their glasses halfway raised, caught between toast and tremor. The moment stretched, heavy with a truth no one could tidy away. I lowered the glass without drinking, slid back into my chair with deliberate calm. Conversation stumbled in patches, trying to resume, but the rhythm of the evening had shifted, and everyone knew it. Some turned from me altogether, pretending I was invisible. Others leaned close to whisper, voices urgent now, rather than amused. A ripple of unease had replaced the easy laughter. Danica recovered quickly, her voice rising with forced cheer as she introduced the band's next song. Her smile wavered only for an instant before she reclaimed the spotlight. But I had seen it, the crack in her perfect performance. Inside, my heart pounded, but not from shame. The humiliation lingered. Yes, but it had lost its hold. Pride stirred in its place. A reminder that silence was no longer my prison. They had wanted me small, voiceless, but I had just reminded them I was still here, and I wasn't finished. The air inside the ballroom shifted after my outburst. Conversations that once swirled in careless circles now bent around me, like smoke avoiding a flame. I caught sight of Danica and Silas slipping toward a far corner, their heads pressed close with a small cluster of allies. They whispered, their eyes darting in my direction, then away again. Guests nearby stopped mid-sentence when I passed, as if the sight of me might carry consequence. The laughter that returned after I moved on felt forced, brittle, and it burned in my ears. No one spoke to me directly, but the message was clear. I had stepped outside the role they had written for me, the quiet, irrelevant old man in the corner, and for that, a punishment was coming. My pulse steadied, even as the unease gnawed at me. I didn't have to wait long. Silas, polished in his tuxedo, leaned against the bar with calculated ease. His voice rose just loud enough for nearby ears, weaving a tale about documents, signatures, and old age. He once signed over part of his property without even realizing it. He chuckled, swirling his glass. Happens when you're not keeping up with the times. I froze mid-step. The words cut sharper than I expected. My name, my property, my life, reduced to casual gossip over champagne. I understood in an instant, forged papers. Silas had been working behind my back, drawing lines on documents I never touched. A wave of heat surged through me, but my face stayed still. My hands gripped the edge of a chair until my knuckles turned white. The whispers multiplied. Guests nodded, laughed politely, tucked away a new story about me. One written not by truth but by deceit. The betrayal settled heavy in my chest, heavier than any humiliation so far. This wasn't just dismissal. This was theft. Later, Silas stood tall near the dance floor, glass raised high. His voice rang out above the music, to keeping the old man comfortable on a budget. The room cracked with laughter. Danica covered her mouth, pretending to scold him, but her shoulders shook with mirth. Others chuckled along, clinking glasses, enjoying the performance. I didn't laugh. Across the distance, I caught Silas's eyes, His grin widened, daring me to falter. The contempt in his stare no longer bothered to hide. For the first time that night, I let mine answer back, cold, steady, unblinking. A hush slid into the space between us, too small for others to notice. But he felt it. I could see it in the twitch of his jaw before he looked away. The fire in my chest no longer raged uncontrolled. It burned steady, focused. They wanted to paint me as powerless, but they had underestimated the patience that had carried me through a lifetime of sacrifice. At my table again, I let the noise fade into background static. The laughter, the whispers, the music, they all blurred together. I whispered words meant only for myself. If it's war they want, they've already lost. The thought wasn't bravado. It was a reminder of what I still held. In a locked drawer at home rested the proof of everything they mocked me for lacking: records, deeds, untouched accounts they didn't know existed, a lawyer's card, worn from years in my wallet, weighted like an old ally. The calm that settled over me was heavier than any anger. I wasn't done, not yet. Tonight was not the battlefield, but it had lit the path. The ballroom sparkled with chandeliers, polished silver, and false smiles. Around me, they believed they had stripped me bare, but beneath my silence, a resolve tightened. They thought they had cornered me. They thought they had erased me. Instead, they had handed me every reason to fight. Music swelled across the ballroom, the kind meant to keep spirits high while champagne blurred the edges of judgment. Yet everywhere I stepped, the weight of whispers followed like a shadow I couldn't shake. The rhythm of the band couldn't drown out the murmurs. They weren't about the bride's dress or the taste of the wine, but about me. I could feel it in the sidelong glances, the way heads dipped closer together as I walked by. Danica and Silas lingered near the edge of the dance floor, their heads bent in close conversation with a cluster of their chosen allies. Laughter flickered from the group, too sharp, too pointed. It wasn't the carefree laughter of celebration. It was the kind that fed on ridicule. Every time their eyes darted toward me, the air in my lungs grew heavier. Under the glittering lights and the hum of violins, a quiet storm brewed, one I could no longer ignore. I had barely turned toward the buffet when I caught the sound of Silas's voice carrying just enough to pierce the music. He was holding a small folder, waving papers for the benefit of the men circling him. "You know," he said with mock seriousness, "he's not the saint people imagine." Years back, he mismanaged funds so badly that the family nearly lost their footing. A ripple of murmured shock spread through the group. One guest frowned at the papers Silas displayed, his finger tracing over the scrawled signature. My stomach clenched, even at a glance. I knew the loops of that handwriting, mine, yet not mine. Forgeries, skillful but clumsy in the way only a desperate hand produces. The sting wasn't just the accusation, but the smug ease with which he delivered it. Those papers were poison, and he knew exactly how to use them. Faces turned toward me with suspicion, whispers growing bolder now. I wanted to shout, to rip the pages apart, but the truth was lodged like stone in my throat. I moved closer, determined to confront the lie. But as I did, conversations faltered, chairs scraped back slightly, just enough to leave a gap as though my presence carried contagion. Even relatives I had known since their childhood avoided my gaze, their smiles fixed in polite discomfort. Isolation spread faster than any rumor. The room I had walked into as father of the bride now felt like hostile ground. My steps slowed under the weight of it, and for a moment I considered retreating entirely. Then, across the room, Jonas's eyes caught mine. My grandson's small face was half hidden behind a chair, but his worried glance reached me like a lifeline. He didn't smile, didn't wave, but that brief look held something truer than all the empty laughter surrounding me. Hope. I retreated toward the farthest corner, where the lights dimmed and the chatter softened into background noise. My hands no longer shook. They were steady, resting flat against the table as though anchoring me. The storm inside had found its direction. "They can paint lies," I whispered to myself, "but truth has its own color, and I'll show it soon enough." Anger no longer felt wild. It was sharp, honed, ready. They thought their forgeries and whispers would define me. They believed their staged laughter could drown me out, but the louder their lies rang, the clearer my own resolve became. The night pressed on, the music masking the false stories being sown around me. Yet beneath it all, my mind worked quietly, carefully, like a craftsman preparing a hidden tool. Every glance of pity, every dismissive whisper, they weren't chains anymore. They were fuel. They thought their lies would bury me. But lies have a way of leaving trails, and I knew how to follow them. The music swelled through the hall, brass and strings chasing one another above the chatter of guests. From my corner table, the laughter carried sharper than any melody. It wasn't joy that rang in those tones, it was triumph, the kind of triumph that comes when wolves think they've pushed the last lamb into the dark. Danica and Silas stood near the head table, their circle of admirers tight as armor. Every so often, Danica's eyes flicked toward me with that same cold smirk, a glance quick enough for her friends to catch and chuckle over. The lies from earlier hung heavy in the room, the forged papers, the whispered gossip, the looks that carved me smaller each time. My chest felt bound with iron. I steadied myself with a long breath, scanning the ballroom for any thread of truth to cling to. For a moment, it seemed there was nothing, only chandeliers gleaming like eyes, waiting to see me sink further into humiliation. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder, firm, steady, familiar. Turning, I met a face I had not seen in years, Harland Creve. His hair, once jet black, now bore streaks of silver, but the sharpness in his gaze had not dulled. Gasps broke from the nearest tables. Whispers rippled out like a stone dropped into still water. People thought Harland had vanished from our town long ago, swallowed by debts or exile. Yet here he stood, solid, unflinching, placing himself at my side without hesitation. "Eldrick," he said quietly. The weight of loyalty carried in just 2 syllables. My chest tightened, relief flooding through veins that had known nothing but tension all night. For the first time since the evening began, I wasn't alone. Danica's voice rang above the stir, brittle with alcohol and power. She clinked her glass with the heel of a knife, calling for attention. The crowd hushed, eyes turning toward her glowing in the golden light. "A toast," she announced, her smile spreading wide. "To my father." Her pause was deliberate, a hook. "A man who showed me exactly what not to be. To the broke old man who lives in shadows of the past." Laughter rippled, brittle and nervous. My chest hollowed at the sting of her words, each one slicing deeper than the last. I gripped my glass, steadying the tremor in my hand. Then a voice boomed across the hall, breaking the air like thunder. "Enough." Harlan's baritone carried through the hall, silencing every chuckle, stilling every fork. He stepped forward, his frame commanding, his finger pointed, not at me, but at the daughter who mocked me. "You all sit here sipping wine, forgetting whose sweat built the ground you dance on. Eldrick worked nights for years so Danica could wear silk at college instead of cotton. He signed checks he could barely cover, poured every ounce of himself into her future. And now she dares call him broke?" Gasps burst from the crowd. Murmurs swelled. I saw heads turn, glances darting from Danica to me, shame creeping into faces that had laughed moments before. Danica faltered, her smile stiff. Silas leaned in, whispering frantically, trying to cover the cracks in their facade. "Don't listen," she scoffed, voice higher now, thinner. "He's just an old friend with grudges. Father's, well, he's sentimental. It's nothing." But the room wasn't united anymore. Doubts spread like fire through dry brush. I saw it in the way guests shifted in their chairs, in the way certain relatives pressed their lips tight, no longer so quick to laugh. I didn't rise. I didn't need to. My silence carried more weight now than their jeers ever could. My fist clenched under the table, not from despair but resolve. They thought the night was theirs, that every humiliation had been nailed shut. But Harlan's voice had cracked the mask they wore, and once a mask cracks, it never fits the same again. They thought I stood alone, but tonight, their empire of lies began to tremble. The room had not recovered from Harlan's booming interruption, even as the band tried to keep the night moving with another round of music. The air was thick with murmurs and sidelong glances. Faces that once ignored me now flickered with uncertainty, while others turned harder, angrier, as if Harlan's words had trespassed on a stage meant only for Danica and Silas. I sat very still, watching the shifting loyalties spread across the hall like cracks in porcelain. Some guests whispered in clusters, leaning toward one another with furtive glances at me. A handful nodded faintly, as though finally remembering sacrifices they had once heard about but never cared to acknowledge. Across the room, Danica's smile stretched wide but rigid, her jaw locked tight. Silas whispered into her ear, his shoulders hunched like a man drawing up battle plans. The music and chatter clashed like competing storms. Yet beneath the noise, there was no mistaking it. The tide had shifted, if only by an inch. Harlan didn't let the moment die. When the chatter dipped, he cleared his throat, his presence commanding in a way I hadn't seen in years. He stepped forward, glass in hand, but his voice carried without the need for a microphone. "I've known Eldrick longer than most of you have known yourselves," he began, eyes sweeping the crowd. "I was there when he worked 3 jobs so his daughter could finish college without a dollar of debt. I was there when he mortgaged land, his own father's land, to help a young man named Silas get a start in business." Gasps stirred, and I saw Danica's cheeks flush crimson, her nails dug into her wineglass stem. "He gave everything quietly, without standing in front of a crowd to claim credit," Harlan continued. "That's the man sitting here tonight." The hall stilled, then fractured again into murmurs, like wind tearing through a weak roof. Guests who had been laughing at me minutes earlier now glanced sideways at Danica. Some nodded at Harlan, others shook their heads as though uncertain whether to believe. For the first time all night, Danica's mask cracked. The easy smile faltered, her eyes flashing with rage as she snapped something at Silas under her breath. He pulled her close, but the tension between them was obvious. Harlan's words were vindication, sharp and necessary. Yet even as my chest swelled with a brief spark of relief, dread coiled inside me. The more Harlan spoke, the more desperate they would become. The betrayal, when it came, was not from them. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, one who had hovered close to Danica all evening, stepped forward. She raised her voice high enough for everyone to hear. "Funny how easy it is for old friends to tell stories, but stories aren't facts, are they? How do we know Eldrick isn't just exaggerating? After all, look at where he sits tonight." The words sliced sharper than expected. My chest tightened, a dull ache spreading as the realization sank in. The rot went deeper than Danica and Silas. There were others, family by blood, who preferred the lie because it served them better. The crowd split again, louder this time, one side defending me, the other clinging to Danica's version of events. Voices overlapped, accusations hissed under the glitter of chandeliers. What had been a celebration now felt like the edge of a courtroom, the verdict hanging in the air. I glanced at Danica, and for a fleeting second, saw her lips curl into a smile of triumph. My own kin had been turned into weapons against me. I did not shout back. I did not plead. Instead, I let the storm rage and sat in silence, my back straight, hands folded over the tablecloth, every insult thrown, every whisper cast like a stone. I absorbed it without flinching. And then, as if drawn by something unspoken, my eyes found Jonas across the room. My grandson. His small, uncertain face was half hidden behind a taller guest, but his eyes locked onto mine with a mixture of fear and something else, attention. He was listening, watching. That was enough. The silence I held grew louder than their shouting. It unsettled some of them, forced their voices to falter. I had lived long enough to know that silence, wielded with precision, could weigh more than thunder. I breathed deep, steadying the fire inside. Tonight was not the night to reclaim it all, but tonight was proof that I would not be erased. They could strip me of dignity with words, but the truth was a tide no one could hold back forever. The hour had slipped past midnight, but the ballroom showed no signs of rest. Music still pulsed, though quieter, As if even the band sensed the tension that had wrapped itself around the room. The air felt heavy. The laughter forced. I could see clusters of guests shifting in little pockets, some stealing glances at me, others whispering with their backs half turned. The night had stopped being a wedding and turned into something else, something raw. Silas leaned in close to Danica at the head table, his jaw tight, his eyes darting across the room like a man searching for weaknesses. Danica's face was stretched into a smile so brittle it looked ready to crack. She was furious. And it was only a matter of time before the mask slipped. Around them, guests fidgeted, no longer sure which way the wind was blowing. Harlan's voice from earlier still hung in the air, like an echo nobody could erase. The crowd's patience wore thin. Murmurs rose, some guests openly questioning what they had just heard, others defending Danica with blind loyalty. The balance in the room felt fragile, like a glass teetering at the edge of a table. Then it happened. Danica stood abruptly, her champagne flute clinking against the silver in her hand. The brittle smile was gone, replaced by fire. Her voice carried sharp and clear, cutting through the air. "My father," she said, spitting the word like it was bitter, "has spent his life spinning stories. He wants you to believe he's a victim, but he's nothing more than a manipulator, ashamed to admit the truth about his failures. He doesn't deserve this stage. He doesn't deserve any of this." The words stabbed deeper than I'd expected, not because they were true, but because of the venom behind them. She turned to me, finger pointing like a judge passing sentence. "You should leave, Dad. This is my night, not yours." "Stop pretending you matter." Gasps broke out. Glasses clinked as hands froze mid-toast. The room stilled. Silence thick as stone. I felt every eye pressing on me, weighing, judging. For a moment, the humiliation was blinding, like someone had pulled the rug from under my feet in front of everyone. But then, slowly, something shifted. A chair scraped. Across the room, a respected family friend, an older man who had known me since the early days, rose to his feet. His voice carried calm authority as he spoke. "That's enough, Danica. I've known your father longer than you've been alive. He built more than you'll ever understand. Without him, none of this, none of you, would be standing here tonight." Another guest chimed in, a woman who had worked with me years ago. She nodded toward me, her words gentle but firm. "He paid for so many of us when we had nothing. Don't you dare call him irrelevant." The murmurs grew, louder this time, but different. Some voices still sided with Danica, but others questioned her cruelty, her arrogance. The air thickened again, but the tide had turned, just enough for me to feel it. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I simply stood, my back straight, my hands steady on the table. Every fiber of me wanted to lash out, to shout the truth louder than her lies. But instead, I let the silence speak. Dignity can be louder than rage if you hold it long enough. Danica's face twisted, her fury visible even through the dim lights. Silas whispered something quickly in her ear, his own composure slipping. Their control of the room was cracking, bit by bit, the way ice breaks under weight. And then, from across the room, Jonas, my grandson, looked at me. Just one glance, but it carried more than all the words flying through the air. Conflicted, yes, but also questioning. The seed of doubt had been planted, not in strangers, but in my own blood. I let the moment linger, let them see me, not as a beaten man, but as one still standing, inside. The sting still burned, humiliation etched deep, but something else grew stronger beneath it, a fire I had smothered for too long. They wanted me broken. The thought echoed in my mind, steady and fierce. But all they managed was to wake something in me I had long kept buried. The night air struck cooler than I expected, sharp enough to sting the lungs. It felt almost cleansing after the suffocating hours inside the ballroom. I lingered near the entrance, the muffled music and laughter still spilling out as guests trickled into the parking lot. Some brushed past me without a glance, heads lowered, coats pulled tight. A few, just a few, offered a nod or a whispered, almost embarrassed word of support, nothing more. Most preferred the safety of silence. It was a familiar sensation, being avoided like a shadow. Their eyes carried fear, fear of being pulled into the storm surrounding me and my daughter's husband. In those sidelong glances, I recognized something I had seen in workers I supervised years ago, the way people avoided standing near the man everyone thought was already beaten. For a moment, a heavy loneliness settled across my shoulders. Danica and Silas had stripped me bare inside that hall. Every insult, every dismissal had chipped away at the remnants of dignity I had carried with me. But the cool air also hardened something inside me. If they believed humiliation would scatter me into silence, they hadn't learned who I was. As I drifted closer to the edge of the lot, a voice carried in the night. "Jonas, my grandson." My pulse quickened. I moved carefully, staying half-shielded by the corner of the building. His words came low, hesitant, but each one carved deeper than anything Danica had said all evening. I need to know I'll be secure," Jonas murmured to Silas. "If siding with you means stability, maybe it's the smarter choice." The words rang like a hammer on hollow steel. For all the bruises Danica had delivered to me tonight, none cut sharper than hearing Jonas barter loyalty for security. I had clung to him as my final tether, the one young soul who might see through the lies. And here he was, wavering. A burn spread across my chest, hotter than the whiskey I had left untouched. Anger swelled, pressing against my ribs, but I swallowed it. I could not afford another outburst that they could twist against me. My silence became my shield. Still, the ache of that betrayal would linger far longer than any insult. I might have turned and left then, too broken to carry on, had Silas's smug voice not floated into the night. He was boasting, careless in his arrogance. "It's already in motion," he told Danica. "The paperwork's filed. Your father's trust will be ours before he even realizes what happened. By the time he scrambles, it'll be too late." I froze. The words pierced through me, sharper than any blade. The betrayal was no longer just emotional. It had been etched into legal ink, hidden in courthouses and files I hadn't seen. My hands clenched against the brick wall at my side. My trust, the last of my wealth, the savings meant for generations, was already under siege. For a heartbeat, despair nearly swallowed me. They weren't improvising tonight. This had been planned for months, perhaps years. My daughter, my own flesh and blood, conspiring with a man who treated me like a piece of unwanted furniture. But despair is a thin blanket. It warms nothing. Beneath it, something else stirred, something colder, sharper, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I lifted my gaze to the dark Carolina sky. Stars pressed faintly against the black, distant but steady. My breath came slower now, steadier. I thought of the documents I had locked away in the drawer of my study, untouched for years. Land deeds, business records, letters of intent, all signed, all sealed, all proof of the life I had built before Danica and Silas ever learned to walk across polished marble floors. And the lawyer's card, crisp and waiting, tucked into a leather wallet. Their arrogance was their weakness. They thought my silence was ignorance, that a man who kept his head down had no teeth left. But I had been underestimated before in my life, by competitors, by bankers, even by family. And every time, it had been the mistake that cost them. The night no longer felt cold. It felt alive with possibility. Each betrayal, each whisper of theft, had stripped away the last hesitation clinging to me. They had given me reason, and reason was sharper than rage. I straightened my shoulders, letting the tension settle into bone-deep steadiness. Somewhere behind me, Jonas laughed nervously at something Silas said, and my heart squeezed tight with the pain of it. But even that pain turned into fuel. If they believed they had broken me, they had not looked closely enough. The quiet of the lot wrapped around me as I whispered words that only the night would hear. "You think you've taken everything. You think you've left me with nothing. But a man with nothing left to lose, that's the man you should fear most." The words didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a promise. I turned away from the hall, my steps slow but steady, carrying me into the shadows. Tomorrow, their empire of deceit would face something it had never faced before. Me, unbound by silence, unafraid of loss. The courthouse in Asheville stood tall, its marble pillars catching the morning sun as I stepped inside. My shoes echoed against the polished floor, each step carrying the weight of years of silence, humiliation, and the fire of everything I had endured. I wasn't alone. Harland Creve, the friend I thought lost to time, walked at my side with the steadiness of a man who had nothing left to prove but everything left to say. Inside the courtroom, the air felt dense with expectation. Danica sat near Silas, their faces drawn but defiant. She wore a carefully chosen dress, trying to project the same power she wielded at her wedding night, but her eyes betrayed a nervous flicker. Silas whispered furiously to her. Papers clutched in his hands, the same papers he had paraded before our family as proof of my so-called incompetence. When my name was called, I rose. My hands didn't tremble, not anymore. I placed a small folder on the bench, the culmination of months of foresight I had quietly prepared while they believed me oblivious. Harlan's testimony came first. He spoke of long nights when I worked 2 jobs to cover Danica's tuition, how I paid off Silas's early debts when his first business floundered, and how every dollar had been documented, every sacrifice written in a ledger they assumed I no longer had. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Harlan's voice carried like a hammer striking steel, steady and undeniable. When I followed, my words were simple. I presented the deeds, the notarized records, the correspondence with my lawyer, all showing Silas's attempted transfer of my trust was fraudulent. His signature, bold as he thought it was, paled when the forensic examiner confirmed it a forgery. For the first time, Silas's confidence cracked. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white around those papers he once used as weapons. Danica's lips parted, her gaze darting around the room for an ally who would no longer come. The judge's ruling was swift. The motions Silas filed were nullified. His fraud entered into record. Murmurs filled the chamber, whispers of disgrace weaving through the benches like wildfire. Opaline dressed, Silas's influential in-law, turned away from Danica, disgust written across her face. In one gavel strike, their empire of deception collapsed. When the session ended, the hall outside buzzed with shifting loyalties. Danica's name, once spoken with admiration, now clung to shame. Silas avoided every eye. His voice gone, I didn't smile. Victory wasn't sweet, it was heavy, like lifting a burden I had carried for too long. Then came Jonas. My grandson's steps were slow, his eyes wet. He stood before me, fumbling with words before they spilled out. I almost stood with them. Grandpa, I was scared. They promised me security. I thought you'd given up on us. His voice broke. My heart tightened, not with anger, but with the deep ache only love can bring. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Fear makes us small, Jonas. But character, that's what carries a man through storms. Money doesn't make you strong. Choices do. He nodded, tears sliding down. And in that moment I felt the tether between us hold fast again. Perhaps he wouldn't repeat the mistakes of his parents. Perhaps there was hope yet. That evening, I sat on my porch, the sun sinking low beyond the hills of North Carolina. The cicadas hummed, the world calm at last after months of chaos. I leaned back, letting the wooden chair creak under me, and breathed in the cool dusk air. I hadn't set out to destroy Danica. No father dreams of seeing his child laid bare in disgrace. But I couldn't let her greed strip away the dignity I had spent a lifetime building. She had to learn that when you sever the roots of family, the tree withers from within. As shadows stretched across the yard, I whispered to myself, not in bitterness, but in peace. When a child forgets where they came from, the ground beneath them will remind them, and when a father stands tall, even in his twilight years, he teaches the world that love and honor are not for sale. The war was over, the lesson remained, and in that quiet, I found something greater than victory. I found myself again,